I move now to our final speaker and the concluding speaker for today's proposition, Unnati Ghia. Unnati is a Master of Law student at Lucy Cavendish College and Inak Shivdasani Cambridge Trust Scholar. She's a former convener of the NLS Debating Society and has won the US-India Comparative Constitutional Law debate. She won the right to speak through open audition. Unnati, the floor is yours.
Do I need to test this or something, or are we good to go? Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to speak here today, especially before such a spirited student gathering. And I say spirited as an understatement because it's been wonderful to listen to all of you. And I'm sure all of you would make fascinating and incredible members of Parliament here someday. What I want to begin by saying is to pick off where the last speaker ended, which is to say that Labour's plan is good. It's a great alternative, the fact that we should nationalize the railway, you should nationalize green energy, all sorts of energy companies. Now, I come from a country where mostly everything has been nationalized since before I was born. And let me tell you the dark side of nationalization as I've seen it. India's had energy companies, coal, electricity, renewable energy, nationalized since the 1970s. There's this idea that's floated by side proposition that nationalization somehow breaks the link between rich private interests and government political class interests. I don't quite understand how that works, because placing the government directly in charge of companies, to me, suddenly doesn't break that link quite at all. Instead, what's happened in India is that all the tenders, whether for coal, for electricity, for renewable energy, go to the same company through an open bidding process, making the owner of that company the fourth richest man in the world today. Just a second. But to conclude my point, and I will of course take your question after that, is to say that nationalization in and of itself, without coming up with a proper plan for efficiency in the long term, for preventing red tape, for preventing political lobbying within the process or within those companies, is a half-baked plan at best. And in the short term, it's not going to solve anything, because that bidding process in and of itself takes a long time. Now, I will take your question.
Thank you. Yeah. Is it not the case that in the past 2 years, we've seen the greatest level of sleaze, the greatest level of corruption in our government contracting, and that it's the Labour Party under Rachel Reeves who has come out with a new charter about how we can avoid such total corruption?
If I take that question at its best, I don't believe that sleaze and corruption, and this might be my own opinion, is often almost and always limited to just one political party or one political class. If you're talking about sleaze and corruption, especially in your bureaucracy, let me tell you it's probably everywhere. At least that's been my experience, and it's probably going to infiltrate into everything. So it's merely saying that we're going to change parties or that this government should be removed on the stance that there is general corruption is, to me, an insufficient argument. I'm fully aware that most of you think this motion to be incontrovertible, even though this government has been in power only for 30 days. I asked myself the same question when I entered the auditions. Do I think this is a balanced motion? Do I think it is as difficult and obtuse a motion as, for example, this House regrets the fall of the British Empire, which to me, I think was indefensible. But as I delved into the events of the past month, and in contrast particularly to the events of the past year, I realized there's quite a bit to say here. And so, despite being in this country for less than 2 weeks, I stand here ready to defend His Majesty's government. I don't think any speaker today has disagreed with the fact that this government faces a gargantuan task. We've talked numbers already, 2 million employment vacancies advertised last month, slowest growth rate, high rate of inflation. Oh, I'm already scared of you. I know you're coming, just a second. Highest rate of inflation. So I don't think His Majesty's government is entirely wrong in focusing on growth, particularly growth through supply-side reforms. But despite the tough times and the enormity of the task before them, the reason I would place confidence in them is their decisiveness and receptiveness, and that is where I find hope. Before I move on to my main argument, let's go.
Three speakers give some sort of dire assessment of the UK. The Conservatives have been in power for 12 years. How many more prime ministers is it going to take when you realise that just putting a new paint of coat on things won't help and the entire foundation is rotten?
I think that's a fair argument to make, and I think that it's a fair argument to make, and this goes to the core of the argument that I'm going to make today, that it's rare for me to have seen a prime minister that after seeing the public opinion on a policy measure actually thought to withdraw it. And I'm going to build on this argument later, and I'm going to tell you why it's an important democratic value to have the humility to withdraw measures that are not popular with your public mandate. I'm going to tell you why it's absent in countries like India, Brazil, and China, which have then proceeded to become, I don't want to get screwed for this later, but authoritarian regimes, and why the UK is thankfully, because of Liz Truss, possibly far away from that. The first point I want to get down to is talking about the system of representation that we have and why it's inherently exclusionary. Our democracies, whether they're presidential or parliamentary, function on the basis of political representation. And the premise of this idea is that you're trusting someone to speak for you. But the premise of that very idea is that both you and your representative will be heard. What we saw during the pandemic, especially in the United Kingdom, is that this fundamental principle of political representation was consigned to the waste paper basket. When political representatives like Boris Johnson decide that they can proceed to party in contravention and violation of COVID-19 laws, when they condone sexual harassment, when they appoint unsuitable candidates, that's all essentially telling the general public that we don't care about your opinion. Now, once again, this isn't unique to the United Kingdom. It's there in China, it's there in Brazil, it's there in India, and of course, Donald Trump is the best example of it. But this complete and utter disregard for public opinion is one of the greatest dangers that most democracies face today. One second. And this is where the promises of democratic participation that we have run absolutely no. Because these representatives don't feel any obligation to explain their actions, they don't feel any obligation to maintain the dignity of their offices, and they certainly don't feel any obligation to review policies merely because opinion polls tell them that that policy is unpopular. I would argue that this is precisely what the previous government did. But I would also argue that this is where His Majesty's government is different from their predecessor and deserves your confidence for two key reasons. First, because I think this is a responsive government that is attempting to combat crises instead of failing to act. The same person, just a second, that asked me a question, I believe previously pointed out that the COVID-19 death toll in the UK was at one point the highest in the developed world because Boris Johnson failed to act. So the fact that this government is so quick to come up with an energy plan is something that deserves your confidence. Let me remind you that the energy prices started rising last year. Wholesale gas prices went up by 250% last year, but the government didn't do enough then. Let me tell you that as of yesterday, the European Commission is still debating on what to do, whereas the UK is already ahead in taking action. This is something that, I will take it, just a second. This is something that deserves your confidence. This is something that deserves some kudos. And before I get to the worst part of this debate,
the reason the energy crisis here is worse than in Europe,
despite their greater reliance on Russia, is because we failed to build gas storage facilities, we failed to build green power, and Labour would build them instead.
I agree with that, but my simple response to that, and you can of course correct me if I'm wrong on the timeline, is that this government isn't responsible for that. And I don't believe you can hold this government and this Prime Minister liable for the faults of the previous. But the second argument that I'd like to make, I'm not going to defend the 45p tax cuts. I believe that Ghia already tried. I'm not going to call Liz Truss a humble pragmatist. I don't believe those are my words. But what I will say is this, and what I do want to emphasize on is this, that the fact that she withdrew a policy that didn't do well with the public and didn't do well with the market is something that needs to be considered. Let me complete my argument. I want to urge that there is a value to politicians today saying that we get it and we have listened, despite extenuating humiliation. Okay, it's protected now, I'm sorry. I want to tie this into my earlier point on public opinion in the representation process, because this is what your representatives are supposed to do. If they float a policy that the public is unhappy with, and the public voices their opinion in the democratic fashion that they're supposed to, they have to withdraw it, and that's precisely what's been done here. This is then clearly a government, it's protected, I'm sorry. This is then clearly a government that values public opinion. And from her speech yesterday, I can't see anything that isn't in line with public mandate. She wants to make NHS appointments faster. She wants to provide better broadband and mobile signal. She wants to push infrastructure projects, which according to me all stem from some sort of compassion, maybe, but at least some sort of understanding of the working class. What is the absolute best case on-side proposition, which is that this government attempted to impose an unfair tax cut that benefits the wealthy. I would say that it is better to live in a democracy where politicians willingly withdraw or review policy that is deemed unfair by the public, as opposed to living in a democracy where you have to wait for the regime to change for such policies to change. I would argue that these democracies are far better. They're far more participative. They're far less authoritarian than the previous kind of regimes. I would like to say that we'd all like to live in a world where the wealthy are not catered to. But I think we can settle for a world where the politicians and the representatives are held liable for when they do cater to the wealthy and when they're forced to withdraw policies that cater to the wealthy. In summation, what I'm going to say is that if this is a government that was decisive and responsive during turmoil, and if this is a government that has tried to acknowledge and accommodate public opinion, then this is a government that you should possibly have confidence in. Thank you so much.